The poet William Blake. Well, he said, eternity is in love with the productions of time. The poet William Blake, he said, eternity is in love with the productions of time. And what are the productions of time? They are the rats and the birds and the hummingbirds and the swans. These productions of time, these ephemeral things, all that lives and dances and then dies. Mountains, rivers, winter, summer, you and I as well. So eternity is in love with these things. Eternity meaning, perhaps, the gods, the great powers of this wild miracle universe in which we live. I am Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Today we will continue our exploration of the Odyssey, that wild sea tale, which is 3,000 years old and is about to happen in a few months. That story which is happening right now. That story in which we are the stranger and we are the king, and the king has a story to tell. That story which is our story, perhaps. That story, perhaps we are in it right now, in this moment. It is said that an epic is a story that joins heaven and earth. So, perhaps in this story we can mingle those two worlds, the world of the eternal and the world of hubcaps and broken spoons in which we live. And so we remember Odysseus. Odysseus, who was telling his story to the Phaeacians, and he told them about how he left the Trojan War and came to a city of the Ciconians and sacked that city. And we remember the island of the Lotus Eaters, where if you eat the flowers growing on this island, you will never want to leave. And we remember the cave of the Cyclops, that dark place where Odysseus succeeded in being nobody for a little while. And then he became somebody and called down on his head the curse of Poseidon, the lord of the sea. So we go again to that feasting hall in the palace of the Phaeacians. There is wine in the sparkling goblets there. The candles are lit, a beautiful circular room. And there is Odysseus, and he stands. And now he begins to speak. And so we set sail once more across the wine-dark sea, our hearts heavy with weeping for those we had lost in the cave of the Cyclops. And we had good sailing across those seas, and soon, far off on the edge of the horizon, we saw a bright light. And we sailed closer, and we saw that it was an island made of bronze. Gray-green walls, all of metal, reflecting the sun. And so we brought our fleet of 12 ships there to that island, and there were docks and stairs along those walls. And we drew our boats in and moored them there. And then I and a few companions got out and walked up the stairs along the side of this bronze island till we came towards the top. And as we approached the heights of this island, we heard in the air the sound of flutes and harps, the sound of horns carried to us on the wind. And we came over the top of the walls, and we found we were on a floating island of white stone. And in the center was a great palace, and around it there were harps and horns, flutes, some of them in trees, others in great towers of harps and horns there, all of them blown and played by the wind. And there were flags and windmills there, a great fluttering chorus of images around us, the windmills, the flags, the hooting, humming horns in the air, like the music of ancient stones. And we walked, marveling in our hearts, toward the palace at the center of the island. And there were large gates and 2 guards there, and they welcomed us. "Welcome, travelers," they said. "Welcome, strangers. Be at home in this place. Welcome." And they opened the doors, and we went inside. And there was a large, round feasting hall, and on the ceiling were emblazoned all the stars of the night sky, all the constellations. and around the circular walls were mosaics depicting all the seasons of the year. And there was a great feast taking place, and there at the head table was a king and a queen. And so we came to the island of King Aeolus, the king of the winds. And he and his wife welcomed us there, and we feasted with them. In fact, we stayed an entire month on their island, feasting and telling stories. For King Aeolus wanted to know all about the Trojan War, all about our wanderings over the seas and the lands of this earth. So we were nourished in our bodies and in our hearts by this visit there with King Aeolus. But after a month, the time came to go. And I went to him and said, King Aeolus, it is time for us to depart back to the rocky island of Ithaca. And he said, Yes, Odysseus, and I have a gift for you. Here. And he clapped his hands, and a servant came and brought a large ox-hide bag. This bag was bursting with something inside it. It was tied with a silver cord. And King Aeolus said, Odysseus, inside this bag are all the winds you do not need. All the winds that will blow you off your course, blow you from your track, your route home to Ithaca. Instead, I have left only the one wind you truly need in the air. That one will blow you sweetly, serenely, strongly right back to Ithaca. So keep this bag closed, and you will get all the way home without trouble. Once there, climb one of the mountains of your island and open this bag, releasing all the winds to the air, for winds do not wish to be captive for long. I will do that, I said. And so we took the ox-hide bag, and we went away from that palace, saying goodbye to King Aeolus and his queen, and all his sons and daughters there, and we walked across that island with the horns and harps playing their beautiful music around us. And we came to the bronze walls and walked down the stairs to our ships. And so we got on our boats and pushed off from the island of Aeolus. And we took hold of our oars, and we paddled a bit, and then we raised our sails. And that sweet wind took hold of our sails, filled them with its gifts. And soon we were racing across the sea, making good time across the wine-dark sea. And I held tight to the steering oar, for I did not trust my companions. I wanted to be sure we went straight for home, straight for that dear island of Ithaca. So I steered all through the day, and all through the night as well. Under the wheeling stars, I steered our boat. Around us the sea whispered and crashed. So the days passed and the nights as well. Finally, I was awake for 9 days. 9 days and 9 nights. And then the sun rose and I looked and I saw an island. And it was Ithaca. It was my dear home. I looked, I could see places I recognized. There was Mount Neriton. There was the hill of Hermes. There were the houses on that island. I looked, that was my own house. And I saw smoke rising from that house, smoke from a cooking fire. Perhaps my dear wife Penelope was even now right there in the hall. Perhaps Telemachus was with her after 17 years. My dear boy, what would he be like? Soon I would be home with both of them. I looked, it was Ithaca, truly it was. And then, with my hand on that steering oar, I fell asleep. I fell into a sweet, sweet sleep, having steered that boat so far. And I heard later what happened. As I slept, my sailors went to the bag. They looked at that bag and they said, "This is no bag full of wind. That's a children's story. That's a fairy tale. No, there's wealth in this bag. There's gold, treasure, good things in this bag. The wealth of King Aeolus given to who? Given to Odysseus, our captain." And what do we have? Nothing. After all those years in Troy, all the wealth we gained in that long war, lost to us in the storms that have hit this boat as we've traveled. No, there's nothing for us but what's in this bag. I say we open this bag and share the wealth amongst us, for Odysseus is not going to share it freely of his own free will. So they spoke, and some tried to talk the others out of it, but in the end, those who wished to open the bag prevailed. And they fell upon it, and they went to that knot tied out of silver cord, and they picked at it for a while, a very tight knot, and then suddenly, like a snake, it unraveled, and the ox-hide bag flew up into the air, and 10 hurricanes were released in all directions, and we went spinning this way and that, bashed and pummeled across the sea. I awoke in the midst of this great gale. I could do nothing. I could not stand or sit up. I just hung on to the boat as it whistled and shrieked across the sea. So we were bashed and pummeled across the ocean, the wild ocean, by those winds, set free from the bag. And finally it came to a stop, and the winds were still, and the sea was calm. We were drenched through by waves that had come washing over our boats. And I looked around, nervously I counted all the boats. They were all there. My entire fleet, all 12 boats had been blown miraculously together back here to this spot on the sea. And far off, on the horizon, we all saw a bright, shining light. We were back where we'd been. So, taking our oars in our hands, we paddled towards that light. And as we came closer, I saw that it was an island made of bronze. It was the island we had left. It was once again the island of King Aeolus. So we brought our boats up to the bronze walls of that island. And Eurylochus, Eurybates, and I, we went up the stairs up to the top of this island. And again we heard the humming, the wonderful sound of the flutes and the harps and the horns blowing and playing in the air. And we walked across those white stones to the great palace at the center. And there were guards at the door, and they looked at us strangely. But they said, come in, travelers, yes. And they threw open the doors, and there was King Aeolus, and his wife, his queen, and his 6 sons and his 6 daughters, and all his subjects. There was a great feast happening right there. But as we entered, everything became stone quiet. And King Aeolus looked at us, looked at me, and said, Odysseus, unlucky man, what brings you here again? And I told him and described how my sailors, out of curiosity and their own avarice and greed, had opened up that bag, and how we'd been blown across the seas all the way back to his island. And I said, now, dear King Aeolus, can you please find it in your heart to help us again? And he said, no, unlucky man, born under a sour star, I will not help you. No, clearly, if something like this has happened to you, the gods must be angry with you, and I will not go against the gods. No, you must leave. Leave right now. Get out of here. Scram! So he shouted, and we turned, and a child threw a spoon at us, and the doors slammed behind us. And we walked, filled with sorrow, across the island, the flutes and the harps playing their music still, jeering at us, it seemed. And we went to those bronze walls and climbed down the stairs and back to our boats. And I and the others, we needed to say nothing about what King Aeolus had said. We just shook our heads sadly, and everyone knew. So we got back into our boats, and we began to row. And it was hard going. The winds, they jeered at us, weak winds that went this way and that, blowing us here and there, as if they were angry with us for having been in that bag for so long. So we went by inches, crawling across the sea. And we rowed for 6 days and 6 nights, our backs aching, our arms tired from that labor of hauling ourselves across the wine-dark sea. And finally, on the 7th day, in the distance, we saw an island. So I and my fleet went closer to that island, sailing there, and we saw, it seemed at first just like a black plug of rock in the water. But as we got closer, we saw there was an immense, beautiful, natural harbor there. Inside, the waves were calm, a place sheltered from the storms of the sea. It was perfect, too perfect. All the other captains, they rowed into that harbor. They moored their boats there by the soft white sand. But as for me, I took my boat. We stayed on the outside. I moored my boat outside that harbor against a rocky cliff. And I and 3 others, we climbed that cliff to the top, and there were trees there, and we looked, and far off we saw smoke rising from a place in the forest. So I sent those 3 ahead to see what they could find. Who lived on this island? Would they be kind and generous, or greedy and cruel? And as for me, I went back to the boat to tell the others what we had seen. Well, later I heard the whole grisly story. How the 3 of them had gone on a path through the forest, and they had come to find a woman there pulling water from a well. A woman who was giant, larger than a man, about 2 men tall she was, lifting a bucket of clear water out of that well. And she looked at them and said, "Strangers, travelers, what brings you here? Who are you, and what are you doing here?" And they told her how they had fought in the Trojan War, and had been blown across the sea by storms and adventures, and had come to this island. And she said, "Well, I am just a little girl, but I will take you to see my father, King Antiphates." A little girl, they thought, a little girl. Well, she turned and went with huge strides into the forest along a trail, and they followed, running to catch up. And soon they came to the largest palace they had ever seen, made out of great slabs of rock. And she led them into a large throne room, everything giant, huge, built for giants. And there was a queen, a woman, a mountain she seemed, a piece of a mountain there. And she looked, "Who have you brought here, my daughter?" "Oh, mother, these strangers have come. Look at them. They're so cute. They're so small." "Yes," she said, "they are small." And she called to her husband, and King Antiphates came into the room, a man larger than his own wife, a huge hulking brute, like a shard of a mountain walking around on the earth. And he looked at my sailors and said, "Aha! Dinner has come to us." And he reached forward and grabbed one of them and devoured him whole in his mouth and swallowed him down. And my 2 other sailors turned and ran pell-mell into the forest. And behind them they heard King Antiphates howling in alarm to all the other residents of that island, the Lastrygonians. And the Lastrygonians, these giant hulking brutes, came out of the hills and the trees, and they descended on that harbor. And they took giant boulders and showered them down on the boats there. And with long spears as big as trees, they skewered the men and lifted them shrieking into the air and devoured them whole. And my 2 sailors, remaining alive, ran back to the boat. I saw them coming down the side of the cliff on a trail. They leapt into the boat. "Run! Go! Go!" And hearing the shrieks and the cries from the harbor inside the island, I took my sword and cut the cable mooring us there to that sea. And we pushed off, and I said, "Row! Row for your lives, or you'll never see home again." So we put our backs into it, pushing off, rowing our boat away from that island. And behind us we could hear the shrieks and the screams of all those who had chosen to moor their boats in the safety of that harbor. So they sounded behind us, and then they could no longer be heard. And so we stopped our rowing, once we were out of range, and we wept salt tears into the salt sea. And then we cried out 3 times for every sailor who had been lost there, on the island of the Lastrygonians. And around us the wind whipped this way and that fitfully. Of all my great fleet, we were the only boat remaining. One single boat. And then there was nothing else to do but take hold of our oars and row. So we rowed for days and we rowed for nights. And finally we came to an island. An island that was green with flourishing trees. And we brought our one boat up onto the shore, brought it up onto the sand. And we got out and sat on that sand, our hearts heavy with weeping and sorrow, remembering all those we had lost in the cave of the Cyclops, all those we had lost there on the island of the Lastrygonians. So we gave ourselves up to sorrow for a time. And then I stood and took my stout spear and walked down the beach to explore. And I came to a stream, and beside it there was a path. And I walked along this path and into the forest. And I hadn't gone far when I saw a stag that came slowly into the path, with a strange, sleepy look in its eyes. And without hesitation, I took my bronze spear, and I hurled it through the air, so it whistled and then cracked into his side, and he leapt once, twice, and the bronze point found his heart, and he crashed down into the stream, and the water began to flow over him. So I went to the stag, I pulled my spear out, and I hefted the body of the stag onto my shoulders, and I walked down the path to the beach, and along the beach back to my sailors, and I cast the stag down before them. "Look, dear friends," I said, "there is hope still, there is breath in our bodies, and there are the gifts of the gods, such as this stag. Let us roast this stag here, and enjoy the life we have, for where is food, there is hope." So we did that, and roasted the stag on the shore, and all day we ate the sweet, delicious meat of the stag, and we drank what wine we had in our ship's stores, and at night we slept there on the beach, grateful to be alive. And in the night I was awoken by a strange sound. It came from far off. It sounded like wolves howling, but it was like no wolves I've heard before. A strange sound, as though the cries of these animals were trying to become words, as though they were fumbling at the door of a new language, trying to say something they could not quite say. And then I drifted off back to sleep. And in the morning I remembered that sound briefly, but then it faded away, as if it had been a dream. And then I gathered all my sailors together, and I said, "We will form two groups. One will stay here, the other will go into the island to see who is here, whether they are friendly and generous or angry and hostile. I will lead one group and Eurylochus the other." So Eurylochus and I cast lots in a helmet and drew them out, and he drew the short stick, and so it was his lot to go. So he gathered 22 of the sailors around him and prepared to go. "Be careful," I said. "Always," he said. And I watched them go down the beach and to the path and then into the forest. And the rest of us stayed there on the shore. And we ate the rest of that stag and gloried in the life we had, the breath in our bodies. We swam in the sea and told stories of our adventures there back in Troy. And when the sun was high in the sky, Eurylochus came back alone. He came walking down the beach with a stone-like expression on his face, and he came to me and he said, "Pigs, they've all been turned to pigs." "What do you mean?" I said. "The men, they've all been turned to pigs. Odysseus, we went along this path down there by the stream. We went into the forest, and soon we came to a large clearing filled with grass, and in this clearing there were wolves and there were lions. But they were like no animals I've ever seen. They were half asleep, under a spell of some kind. They had sad eyes. They did not grunt at us, did not roar at us, did not seem to notice us even. They were just lolling about in the grass. And in the center of this field there was a beautiful house of polished stone, and there was smoke rising from the chimney of this house, and inside we heard a beautiful musical voice, the voice of a woman, singing a delirious, beautiful song. And we took this in, and then Paramedes spoke and said, "Gentlemen, look, let's go. This is clearly a good house. Clearly there's a woman singing in there who would give us nourishment and drink and food. We've traveled a long way. Let us go into this house and find rest and recuperation there." And I said, "No, Paramedes, this looks bad to me. This looks strange. Look at these animals. They're under a spell of some kind. I don't think this is a good idea. Let's stay here and watch and see what happens." "Oh, Eurylochus," Perimedes said, "don't be afraid. Come on, look at this house. Do cannibals sing like that? Do man-eating cannibals sing like this? No, this is a kind, beautiful woman, I think. Let us go, boys." So he spoke, and they all listened, and I could not dissuade them. And they walked towards the house. But I hung back, hiding behind a bush. And as they approached, suddenly she stopped singing and came out of the house, and she stood there, a tall woman dressed in red and black, and there were hawk feathers dangling from her belt, and around her neck she had necklaces of turquoise and of cowrie shells, and there was the tail of a crab in her hair. And she looked at them with green eyes and said, "Sailors, travelers, you've come a long way. Here, be welcome in my house. Come inside. You look like you could use a good welcome. Let us eat and drink and share the wealth of this earth, and then you can tell me your stories." So she invited them in, and they came. They followed. They went into that house. And behind my bush I listened carefully. I heard them talking. I heard chairs moving along the floors. They found their places. I heard laughter. I heard the clinking of glasses, and then I heard snorts, squeals, grunts, and then I heard hooves on the stone floor, tapping, tip-tapping along the floor, and as I watched, 22 pigs came out of that house. 22 sailors went in, Odysseus, and 22 pigs came out. And she was behind them, and she ushered them out into the grass, and she took a clutch of acorns from her dress, and she scattered them down into the grass, and they began to snort and snuffle and eat up those acorns. And with a glimmer in her eyes, she turned, casting one glance out into the field. For a moment I thought perhaps she knew I was there, and then she turned and went into the house. I came running back to you. What are we going to do, Odysseus? This is some magical lady of the beasts. She is dangerous, I say. How can we free them? What are we going to do? Have no fear, Eurylochus, I said. You stay here. I will take my stout spear, and I will go and see what can be done. And if I do not come back in 3 days, my friend, then get in the boat and set sail for home as fast as you can. Do you hear me? I do, Odysseus. Be careful. Always, I said. And I walked down the beach with my stout spear, and came to that stream and to the path, and I walked along the path deeper into the forest. And around me birds sang in the trees, and the wind whispered through the leaves of those trees. And I went this way and that, up a hill, around a corner, down into a gully, and then from out behind a tree a young man came walking. He had golden sandals on his feet, and he looked at me, and he said, "Traveler, I greet you as a traveler, for I am a traveler also, for we are all travelers from birth to death, and then back again, are we not? We live in circles, changing man. Well, this is not the time for you to change. This is the time for you to remain who you are. Here, take this." And he took a flower out of his pocket, a white flower with black roots. "Here, take this, Odysseus. Eat this flower. Eat this flower, it will keep you yourself, for now is not the time to change. You must not change, O changing man. And by the way, when you get to the land of the dead, give my best to your grandfather, Autolycus, for he burned many offerings to me years ago, and I remember him fondly." And with that, this man with golden sandals turned and took one step up into the air, and a moment later he was gone. Though out of the corner of my eye I saw a man high up running into the clouds. I looked down. There was the white flower with black roots, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I nibbled that flower. I ate it. I devoured it. I chewed it, swallowed it down. It tasted of twilight and goat skin. A red smell inside it, a beautiful scent, a flavor, like stones at the bottom of the sea, like new plants growing inside our thoughts at night. Magical. So I swallowed that flower. I looked around. I did not feel any different. But perhaps that was the point. And then I took my spear and I walked down the path through the forest. And then I came to the field. And there were the animals, just as Eurylochus had said. There were the wolves and the lions. But it was true, they had sleepy expressions. There was a dim, sad light in their eyes. They did not roar, they barely grunted. They looked at me, they pawed the air a little bit, and then turned away. And there was the house made of polished stone. There was smoke rising from the chimney, but I listened and I heard no singing. Perhaps she was not there. Perhaps she had gone out. Perhaps she was waiting for me somewhere else. I turned this way, that. Perhaps she was in the trees. I took one step towards the house, then another, and then suddenly from the side of the house there came a herd of pigs. Snuffling, rooting pigs. They came to my feet, to my knees. They licked me, nibbled my skin. These were my sailors. 22 pigs. I counted them. My sailors turned to pigs, and I looked, and she stepped out of the house. A tall woman, dressed in red and black, with hawk feathers dangling from her belt, and the tail of a crab in her hair, and green eyes, and cowrie shells and turquoise around her, and necklaces. And she looked at me and said, "Welcome, stranger, welcome to this place, to this island. You look like you have come a long, long way. Could you use a good welcome, traveler?" "Yes," I said, "yes, for I come from the windy plains of Troy. I fought in the Trojan War there, and on the way home a shipwreck destroyed my ship, and all my crew was lost. I alone survived. I was washed up on an island. I made a raft, and so I drifted on that raft across the sea to this island. So I am glad for your welcome, dear lady. Well, come in. You've had your share of sorrows. Come, enter my house. Be welcome here." So she began to walk towards her house, and I followed. And we went inside, and there was a large oak table there. And far in the corner there was a beautiful loom, and all around there were plants drying over the rafters, jars of seeds and strange powders I'd never seen before. And there by the fire there was a wolf, right by the fire. And this one was not half asleep. He had bright eyes. But he looked at the lady there, and she gave a motion with her hand, and he stayed still by the fire. And she invited me to her table, and she said, "I am Circe, the lady of this island. Here, let us share some wine together." And she took 2 goblets from a shelf, and she poured sparkling red wine into these goblets. And she offered me one, and she took the other. And she said, "Let us drink. Let us drink to Hermes," I said. "Let us drink to Hermes, the messenger god, the quick-footed one." "Yes," she said, "let us drink to Hermes." So we drained our glasses there by her table, and then she turned and looked at me with new eyes. She looked at me the way a lion looks when he's stalking a deer, and she took a hawk feather from her belt and raised it up into the air and approached as though she were about to strike me with it. But in a moment my hand flashed out, and I grabbed her wrist, and I pulled my sword out, and I said, "Your magic won't work on me, you witch!" And I pressed my sword against her neck, and she said, "Odysseus, Odysseus, I should have known it was you. Hermes said you would come." "Well, put that thing away. There's no need to deal like this. You and I, no, I think you and I can come to an agreement. Yes, you and I can agree on a few things." And she reached out and brushed my cheek with her hand. And I said, "I will agree to nothing so long as my men are out there rooting in your yard." "Ah," she said, "well, I will change that. Come, put your sword away, and I will make them men again." So I took my sword away from her neck, and she reached out to a shelf, and there was a shell with an ember in it. And she put leaves on top of that ember, and they began to burn, the smoke rising into the room. And she walked from that room out the front door of her house, and I followed. And we went out into the field, and the pigs gathered around her, and she wafted that smoke into the air over their bristling backs. And then she spoke words in a strange moonlit language I had never heard before. "Kashklumba lahaina sus lahaina hafaina sufsinda," she said. "Aida chodaiza slalaha." And as she spoke, the bristles seemed to fall from the backs of the pigs, and they moved this way, flowing up into the air, growing almost like flowers up towards the light, standing up, shoulders, arms, knees, feet, eyes, hair. They were men once again. and they yelped, and some of them wept, and they roared at the clouds, and one picked up tufts of the grass and inhaled it, smelling the grass scent. They looked around, crying, weeping, laughing, joyous to be human once again. And they looked around at the world with their human eyes, and they saw me, and they saw Circe. Odysseus, they said, welcome home, boys, welcome home. But her, they said. It's all right, I said. It's all right. We've made an agreement, she and I. Yes, dear sailor, she said. Come into my house. Enjoy the good food there. There will be no tricks this time. And I turned and walked into Circe's house, and she followed, and cautiously, carefully the sailors came as well. And we sent one of them back to Eurylochus there on the shore to alert all the others to come to Circe's house. And then we all gathered there in her hall around that great oaken table. And she brought out bread and cheese and meat and the good fruits of this earth. And she poured sparkling wine into our glasses, and we all drank, and we were not changed. So we sat at her table and enjoyed the good things that were before us there. And as time went on, we told our stories, telling her all our travels since the Trojan War, all we'd been through. And as we spoke and feasted there, the sun went down, and darkness covered the world. And when the wheeling stars were overhead, and the candles were burning low on the table, she took my hand and drew me towards a staircase in the corner, a spiraling staircase, and we went upstairs to her golden chamber. And there we found a new agreement, an agreement of our voices and of our stories and of our bodies as well. And our breaths mingled together there all night as the wheeling stars shone down and darkness covered the world. Next day, we gathered in her hall, and we feasted once more. So day by day, we lived in that place, grateful for the hospitality of Circe, the lady of the beasts. And days became weeks, and weeks became months, and she taught me many things. For she would take me into the forest and teach me about the plants, which ones could heal and which ones could hurt. And she taught me how the buzzing music of this world lives inside the stones, and how the years to become can be heard inside the music the waves make at night. And she taught me about the magic the moon gives to this world, and how a rabbit's foot can speak to us of 1,000 years of history, and how we can plant seeds in this moment, and we can tell if they will flourish or if they will wither away. So an entire year went by, there on Circe's island, and in that time I learned many things. We all rejoice to be in that beautiful place. And then one day, I was gathering leaves in a field for a concoction that Circe was teaching me how to make. And as I was doing this, Eurylochus came to me, and he said, Odysseus, have you forgotten who you are? You do not live here. None of us live here. We come from the rocky island of Ithaca. That is our home. Penelope, your dear wife. Telemachus, your dear boy. Don't you remember? Are you yourself? Have you forgotten who you are? And I looked at him, and something shifted in my heart, and I remembered. "You're right," I said. "You're right. It's time to go." "Yes," he said. "It's time to go." And that night there was a bonfire outside Circe's house, as there always was. And we gathered there around that roaring fire, and we sang loud and joyous songs. And as we were singing and drinking the sparkling wine of that island, I turned to Circe and I said, "Circe, it is time for us to go. Can you tell me how we can come home? Can you tell me how I can wash away the curse of the Cyclops from my life? How can I appease the anger of the great god Poseidon?" And she looked at me with sad and serious eyes. And then she took my hand and led me away from that bonfire to a small hut behind her house, a hut she had never let me enter. And we went in, and by the light of 13 candles there, we settled down on the floor. And the floor was of sand, and she took out a bag from her cloak, and she took out cowrie shells from that bag, 9 of them, and she threw them onto the sand. And as she did so, she hummed and sang a strange whispering melody. And she threw them down 9 times, these 9 cowrie shells. And she looked at the pattern there, and she sang and whispered and sang almost under her breath as the candles flickered and the shells made shadows on the sand. And then she turned to me and she said, "Odysseus, I do not know how to remove the anger of Poseidon from you. I don't know how you can appease him or free yourself from this curse. But there is one who does, and his name is Tiresias. Tiresias, the seer of Thebes, the 7-gated city. For he has knowledge of both the moon and the sun, of the dark and the light, of the shadow and the brightness of the stars and the sun. For he has been both a man and a woman in his life. Born a man, he became known in the city of Thebes for his skill at prophecy, at seeing the future, at healing the sick, at working all manner of charms. And then one day, he went walking outside the city of Thebes, walking on the great mountain Cyllene. And he was walking there, and in the cool of the day, in the shadow of a rock, he saw 2 snakes making love. And he took a stick, and without a thought in his head, he hurled that stick at the snakes. And as it struck the 2 snakes, Tiresias' own body began to change and to shift like a river flowing, overflowing its banks. So he changed, swelling, changing this way and that way. And so he became a she. And she turned from that rock where the snakes had wriggled away from, and she walked down from that mountain toward the 7-gated city of Thebes. And she began a new life there, a new life, and she took a man as her husband, and lived there for a long time, and gave birth to a child. Mantes was her name, a woman known for her power at seeing the future as well. And in these days, Tiresias, she studied with a woman of power in the forest, and learned things. Doors were opened to her that had been locked before. And she saw far down those hallways, and she entered rooms of thought that only she could enter, and was taught and instructed by this woman of power in the forest. And years passed, and her daughter grew up there in the city of Thebes. And then one day, she went walking on Mount Cyllene. And as she did so, she passed a rock, and in the shadow of this rock there were 2 snakes making love. And without a thought in her head, she picked up a stick and hurled it at the snakes. And as it struck the snakes, she felt her body begin to change, flowing, moving like a river overflowing its banks, changing its banks. And soon she became a he. And he walked down from Mount Cyllene, and he walked back to the city of Thebes. And he lived out his life there, knowing much about the magic of this world, helping others by his charms and his ability to see the future and far off into the depths of eternity itself. So Tiresias is the man you must talk to, for he has been a woman as well as a man, and he has great powers of seeing the secrets of this world. Excellent, I said. How am I to find him? Where does he live? Must I go to Thebes? Where must we sail now? Well, that's the trick, she said. Because the thing is, Tiresias is dead. He's dead? Yes, he's gone down to the underworld. So you must seek him there, Odysseus. So you must travel across the great stream of Oceanus at the edge of this world, through the Cimmerian lands, the people there who live always in twilight, and you must come to the land of the dead itself. And I began to weep as she described this journey, this long, painful journey. When you get there, she said, you must bring milk and honey, water and sweet wine. You must dig a trench there where the river of fire and the river of sorrow come together. And dig a trench and fill it with these gifts for the ghosts. And then take a ram and a black ewe and sacrifice them. A white ram for our father the sun, a black ewe for our mother the earth. Slaughter them there and pour the blood into the ditch. And then the ghosts will come and they will drink of the blood. They are silent, these ghosts. They are just whispering shades. But as soon as they drink the blood, then they will be given the power of speech. And for a time, you will be able to speak with them, and Tiresias will come, and you can ask him your question. So she described our journey, and I wept to hear such a long and painful journey, down to the land of death itself. So Circe and I spoke together there, in the light of those 13 candles, the two of us speaking of bones and ghosts, of dust and of ash. And then we walked hand in hand back to the bonfire, where my sailors were singing loud and joyous songs. All right, then. Thank you for considering this story. Thank you for entering it with me. Thank you for giving your attention to this ancient beast, which is happening right now, and will happen, and has happened in the past. There's so much in this part of the story. It's very rich. As always, I would ask you to go. I would invite you to go where you want to go in the story. Think back over it. Let it go to work on you. Like a masseuse, if I can use that word, like a massage therapist, like someone thumping your muscles. Where does it hurt most? Where does this pin stick in you? The acupuncture needle that says, oh, that's it. That's the part. Yeah. That's where the juice is, the dazzle. That's where the boom bam is for me. Yeah. Wow. So we took up our oars and we rowed. That's where my head goes. It's a small moment, but right now in this season, I'm speaking to you in autumn. That's how I feel. Just keep rowing. Keep rowing. Maybe it's a time of my life I'm in. Who knows? Just keep rowing. But there's lots in this story, as I said. The King of the Winds, Aeolus. Wow. How would that be for you? If someone said, I'm going to take everything that will blow you from your path, everything that will keep you from your goal, and put it in a bag. Everything that will keep you, that will impede you in your growth. Everything that will stop your progress towards being who you can really be. Everything that will keep you from flourishing. I'm putting them in a bag. and I'm going to give it to you. Yeah, that's amazing. It's like Pandora's box, which has all these horrible things in it. How can you not open it? Well, in this case, it's not, Odysseus who opens it, it's his sailors. In the Jungian sense, we can look at this story as all the characters are parts of yourself, parts of myself. So who are those folks, the sailors? Well, when the boss falls asleep, the other voices start to have their way with what's going on. They start to take over. When you fall asleep at the wheel, when you fall asleep in your life, when you fall asleep and are not awake and aware, then you succumb to some other impulses in you that are perhaps greedy and want something for themselves. When you are not watchful, you eat that candy bar, you spend that money, you do whatever it is that, whatever vice it is, if you want to call it a vice, whatever it is that is not in your best interests, but is perhaps in the interest of some small-minded short-term gain for you, some hunch you have. So they open the bag, and he doesn't trust them. That's quite interesting as well. Why does he need to stay awake for 9 days? Can't he just say, we're all on the same team, fellas? Let's go. Let's work together on this. I'm going to sleep. You take the tiller. You know the way home. Everything's good. That's a whole nother sub-story of the Odyssey, perhaps, is how his sailors and he relate. Do they trust him? Has he made good decisions? Whoa, I don't know. That's a big suitcase to open and unpack there on the bed. Lots of things in there. No, he hasn't made good decisions, has he? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's what I would say. Cyclops Cave, yeah, well, saying you were nobody, good move. Saying you're somebody, bad move, right? Sacking the Siconian city. He didn't succeed. Often in this, I get the feeling the power structure in this story is not so, it's not as dictatorial as I might think. He's got a fleet of 12 boats, but the other sea captains make decisions on their own. He's not the big boss. He might be sort of the leader, but back when they were sacking the city of the Siconians, he tried to convince them to leave and not hang around, and he failed to do that. They hung around, and they got killed. Later on, he tried to get he chose to moor his boat. The Lastrygonians, well, that's a whole thing. He chose to moor his boat outside that perfect harbor. They all went inside, and they all died. So what is the relation with his sailors? And, of course, it probably changes over the course of this story. How much do they trust him? How much does he trust them? Well, not enough to keep hold on the tiller there, it seems, because he's got to do it himself. I have certainly run into that in my life. With men and with women. Perhaps you have as well. Someone who hangs on until the thing just dies, Bob, you've got to stop driving, Lisa, you've got to stop running this organization. You're burned out. No, it's mine. I'm hanging on. I don't know. When I was a kid, I was in the Boy Scouts, and we had a scout leader. Yes, I was in the Boy Scouts. That's a confession I'm making. This is confessional time here on this show, on this project. I was a Boy Scout, and for better or for worse. And we had a troop leader who was getting old and was messing things up, but would not surrender leadership of the troop. Sounds like a small thing, but in my little world of being, 13, 14 years old, it was kind of a drama. And he, kids were earning their Eagle badges, and they weren't getting their Eagle badges awarded to them because he didn't fill out the paperwork, or he would, collect money for dues and then mess things up financially. But he, a bunch of parents tried to get somebody else to be in there and be the troop leader, and he felt stabbed in the back and would not go for it. So in the end, that troop died. That organization fell apart because he could not lead it anymore. He was incompetent and failing. So that's what happened. So that's just an example from my life of somebody hanging on until something dies. It happens with rock bands, right? It happens at Martha Stewart Omnimedia, where I was a temp for quite a while, actually, and saw the death grip on success and control there in those executives, female executives, I'm saying, just because we usually think of men doing this, but let's be wide open about it, right? I mean, men and women can both do this, of course. It's not a gender thing. Even though in the past, perhaps men are cliche, stereotypically hanging on to things. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, Odysseus here can't let go, literally. He's got his hand on that tiller. I'm going to get us home, guys. And of course, that doesn't work, and he falls asleep. And they open the bag. So all of those impulses, all those things which were going to blow them away from their goal, they were released. And there they are, back where they started, with King Aeolus. So that whole story is just great. I don't know. It sings in me, that story. How we relate to others and to groups, how we relate to control. And he sleeps a lot in this story, Odysseus does. He moves, this warrior guy, this arrogant soldier who we meet at the beginning, he falls into passivity, this passive state. When you're asleep, you're not dead, but you're passive, right? People can pick you up and move you, perhaps. Things happen in the world and you are not aware of them. Over and over again in this story, he is instructed through sleep, we might say. He arrives, spoiler alert, but he arrives home in Ithaca and he's asleep. He falls asleep later when his sailors do other bad things on the island of Thrinacia, of the sun god, but of course that is yet to come. So, yeah, well, let's try to stay awake, I guess, and let's try to share power with others. Yeah, so then we get the Lastrygonians. Boy, well, let me confess, as a storyteller, there's been times where I just cut that whole thing out, because we've already had the Cyclops, these, man-eating brute, the Cyclops. We've already had our gory, relationship with the Cyclops, who's a horrible, big, evil giant, sort of. And so why do we need more big, huge, monstrous people? But, I mean, and as we tell these stories, even something like the Odyssey, we should remember we can change it, right? It has been changed in the past. We can change it now. If we want to change the story, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion. How much can you change it without doing a disservice to the soul of the story? But anyway, so for me, for a while, I was like, Lastrygonians, wow, do we need more giants? But now, where am I now? I'm feeling we do need those giants. Because Odysseus is running into an unstoppable force for the first time in this story. Definitely the Cyclops is something to wrestle with, that's for sure, but he outwits the Cyclops. The Lastrygonians are just brute power that he cannot fight, and he cannot trick or clever his way out of the situation. The only thing to do is run. Run for your life. Run, run. That's it. That's the only strategy. He's a man of strategy, right? Over and over again we hear, he's clever. He does this. He solves problems, and he does succeed in that in the Trojan War, in the Iliad, and in this story, the Odyssey. But in this situation, you just cut that cable that is keeping your boat anchored there. There's no time to pull it up, and you run, you go, you paddle as fast as you can. He gets a few points for cleverness for being wary, right? He doesn't moor his boat in that harbor, though everyone else does. He is suspicious now, perhaps more than he was, maybe. I don't know. He's always been suspicious, I guess. But after the Cyclops incident, he's like, whoa, I'm going to be careful. I'm going to stay outside. This looks too perfect, this harbor. So then they reach the Lastrygonians, and it's kind of horrible. So anyway, I've come to see this episode in the story as kind of important in a way. When do we meet forces that are beyond our powers? Well, all the time. Weather, right? Weather, is that a storm? How many of us have had arrogance with weather? I certainly have. It's not going to rain, and you go out and it rains, or it's not that hot and it's stinking hot. Yeah, well, you can probably think of many examples yourself, but he meets an overwhelming force, and all he can do is run. So in that sense, there's only one avenue of action left to him, which is a new one for Odysseus on his trail here, as he is schooled in so many things in this story. And then we get the island of Circe. Amazing, this whole section. You can look at stories as mandalas, right? You can chart them in a circular way, and that's a quite interesting thing to do. If I were to do that, I would have Penelope at the top in the 12 o'clock position and Circe in the 6 o'clock position at the other side. He's encountering the feminine throughout this story. The Iliad, once again, a story of testosterone, for lack of a better word. There's a lot of fighting in that. And again, I'm not trying to close doors here. These are parts of ourselves. Yang and yin. Iliad is very much a yang story, bam, fighting, bam, bam, but with sorrow in it and with certainly some shadowy sides as well. This story much more yin, so to speak, if we're speaking of Chinese philosophy. More feminine in feeling, more dark and shadowy, more he wanders, right? It's not a straight line. We wander all around. And so we get to Circe, the lady of the beasts, and he is schooled by her. And it's a delight, I would just say. For me, anyway, he's schooled in who knows what. Definitely in the knowledge of plants and magic, of things like that. Who knows what else. He spends a year there, and he's going to stay. He's almost forgotten Ithaca. And his sailors have to remind him, hey, look, this isn't our home. Who are you really, Odysseus? We go through life and we get into relationship, romantic relationship. And for me anyway, before I could really be honestly and with an open heart in a sustained relationship, before I could really commit to another person, I had to go through this sort of zodiac of positions of relationship. What I mean is I had to get dumped by someone else. I had to have a long distance relationship. I had to be in relationship with someone older than me and be in relationship with someone younger than me. I didn't plan this. This isn't like a card I had to fill out, a journey. But looking back, I can see that was true. I needed to experience all these different facets of the relationship between two people, in my case, a man and a woman, and be schooled in that before I was ready to really commit. And I see Odysseus going through a similar process, perhaps, in this story. So for me, yes, I was in a relationship with an older woman at one point, and that was an education, where she had the power and I did not. And she was in the world in a very strong way, and she had things to teach me. And so I learned. And so I learned, and so I left, right? Because relationships start and they end. So in this story, Odysseus, it seems to me, is going through a similar thing. He's learning from a woman more powerful than he is. He, thanks to Hermes, only through that, I suppose, he survives and is not turned into an animal, right? But he doesn't really have the upper hand in this relationship, it seems to me. And what does she want? Well, that's a whole nother question. There's an amazing novel called Circe by Madeline Miller, just came out a few years ago, which dreams into her role and her character in a beautiful way. So I invite you to check that out. Yeah, who is she? What does she want? She's the daughter of the sun god, which is interesting. Helios is her father. And a nymph named Perse, if I'm remembering how to say that correctly, is her mother. And she's alone on an island. Interesting. Why would she choose to do that? What in her past would make her want to do that? She wants to be alone, perhaps. Or perhaps she was made to be alone. Well, we can wonder. We can wonder. But Odysseus learns many things from her in that year. And then finally the spell is broken by his sailors. And he asks her, how do I get home? How do I free myself from the anger of Poseidon? And then we get as well this wonderful gender-swapping story of Tiresias, who was born a man but became a woman and then became a man again, and so has a wider knowledge than others. It's a beautiful idea, right? I mean, we like to, I don't know, is it possible we like to, we blur the genders, sure, but this story also tells us that there's something women know that men don't, and there's something men know that women do not, and cannot know, perhaps. Now, he also studies with a woman of power there, which is something I sort of added in because clearly something like that seems to have happened. It feels right to me. But Tiresias is wise because he has knowledge of the male and the female, which is an interesting thing to ponder on, to simmer with. What does that mean? And he's the one who can tell Odysseus the deep answer of what is going to happen to him and how to free himself from this curse of the god Poseidon. So I love this whole interlude. It's one of the more peaceful moments in the story, in a way. They're just living on this island for a year. And has he forgotten Penelope? Has he forgotten Telemachus? Well, that's the question. Hard to know. It seems like he has at times. It seems like he has. But when his sailors mention it, he does respond. So I think back on this story. I think of that crackling fire outside Circe's house. And these men who were pigs previously. That's a whole thing as well. I almost forgot that part. Turned into an animal. Is that what relationship does? This is a woman in this story. When men are near her, they act like animals, basically. They become animals. Does that ring any bells for us out there in the world? Is that something that actually happens? Yes, I think it is. And this story makes it so wonderfully clear. And not just any animals, they're pigs. Yeah, relationship, physical relationship, lust, right? Those things can alter us. And who was I a moment ago? I was a pig rooting in the mud, and now I'm a professor of law at whatever, Oblivion University. Yeah, so that's something in this story which is very beautiful as well. She turns them into animals. She could kill them, you would think. She's super magical, it seems. Why does she keep them alive as pigs? Does she need the meat? Does she like having them under her control but not dead? Is she going to awaken them one by one later into human form? It's kind of very interesting to think about the possibilities. But in the event, as we say, Odysseus manages to free them, and they become men again. So when I think back on this story, I connect with that. I connect with becoming an animal for a while. And I connect with that bonfire outside of Circe's house, as I said. And groaning our way across the sea. Rowing those boats across the sea. Thank you for listening to this story. There is a lot of richness in this story. I invite you to enter it and hang out with it. Other ways to do that, besides listening to me babble like this, is to choose a moment in the story and connect with it in some way. It's much the same as relating to our dreams, as advice people have for connecting with our dream life. Find a moment in the story and connect with it. One way to do that is to draw a picture of it. Who cares if you are a good artist or whatever? Just draw a picture of it. And another way is to write about it. One thing I've done with folks is choose a moment in this story and first describe it very well, as deeply as possible, and then write some words to yourself from that moment. Perhaps from a character in the story, perhaps from a thing in the story, a moment. The loom in Circe's house, what does it have to say? One of her animals, that stag killed by Odysseus, what does it have to say? What does it have to say to you? Give it your attention first so you can really be there with it, and then write some words from the point of view of an object, a character, an animal in this story. A shell on the beach. Wherever your imagination goes. Dream with this story, and in that way let it go to work on you. We get stories in our lives and we want to change them often, but it's like having a guest come to your house and telling them that their shoes are wrong, their hat is wrong, they got to change their shirt, and they got to talk different. We don't want to do that. We want to welcome this story into our lives, and we will be changed by it instead of the other way around. That's what we should be asking. Not, how can I change this story to make it better, more to my liking, but how can I be changed by this story? Go to work on me, story. That's what we should be saying. And also I would say, as others have pointed out to me, it's more useful to think of yourself as inside the story than the story as something outside of you that you have in a book, in a recording somewhere. Perhaps it's something you are inside somewhere right now in this story. Perhaps there are people in your life who are like the characters in this story. Perhaps you are on the sea. Perhaps you have dealt with the last Dragonians. Oh boy. I hope not, but perhaps. Perhaps you have dealt with King Aeolus and the Bag of Winds. Perhaps you have dealt with Circe, or someone like that. Perhaps a man like Circe, a man who enchants women and turns them into animals. Who knows? Thank you for listening to this, and take care. Once again, I am Jay Leeming, and you can find more stories on my website, which is jayleeming.com, JAYLEEMING.com. And many thanks to the Patreon community out there, which has helped me to maintain this practice of telling stories like this and putting them out there for free to folks in the world. So thank you for doing that. And if you're able to join them, please do so. It helps to support this work of getting these nourishing stories out into the world. You can do that through my Patreon site. Patreon.com/storyjl is the way to find that. Thanks very much, and take care.